to my channel. It is very hard to believe that summer is nearly over and the Burr months are upon us. So to celebrate the ending of summer, I wanted to do a summer reading wrap up and talk about the books that I really enjoyed over this summer. I read 5 books this summer and I'm currently on my 6th to wrap up the summer months, which in comparison to other book talk, booktube people is really unimpressive, but I like to take my time when I read and I like to really delve into the story that I'm reading, so I hope that resonates with you, and I'm excited to share these books with you. I had a really good summer reading list and I really enjoyed the books that I finished, so let's dive in. The first book that I read this summer was The New Seoul Park Jelly Massacre, which is Korea's greatest theme park, where an ominous man tempts visitors with a mysterious jelly candy that promises an unbreakable bond. As we enter the theme park, we follow the storylines of several different characters who all get a taste of the jelly candy. Little do they know that a sinister force lurks beneath the innocent facade. The sweet and innocent soon turn grotesque as the jelly becomes the catalyst for a sticky sweet massacre. Now, I was originally drawn to this book because the cover is just so pretty. It's such a pretty cover. It's very colorful and yet it alludes to something very sinister. So I think the cover perfectly describes the story inside, but I think the story itself was very enthralling, very intriguing, and also really visceral. It's sticky and sweet yet sinister, which I think is such a fun combination, especially during the summer. And I really enjoyed how this book discusses yearning for connection through body horror. I thought that was really creative, and it's essentially like melting into the ones that you love, yearning for connection in a way that turns sinister very quickly. I think that if you like horror, this would be a good summer read for you, and you can round out your summer reading with something sticky and sweet like this. And what better setting for a summer horror than a theme park? So this one was really, really fun, and I do recommend it. The next book I read this summer was the final book in the Poppy War trilogy, which is The Burning God. And if you are returning to my channel, if you're familiar with my content, then you know that I absolutely love R.F. Kuang, and I love the Poppy War. I have a full video on the trilogy as a whole if you'd want to check that out. But The Burning God is the 3rd book, as I mentioned, and it follows Rin's journey from war orphan to war general to shamanic god. Within the final book of this trilogy, Rin is on a war-torn path to break down, destroy, and rebuild Nikon in her image, and she becomes a figurehead for the rebellion, a symbol for the South, who fight head-on with colonial forces as well as the elite and wealthy factions from the North. However, victory, absolution, and peace aren't all what they seem at the end of this war. This series, this trilogy, I think will stick with me for the rest of my life. I love this trilogy, but I can't in my right mind recommend it to people in real life. Like if people at work ask me like, oh, what's your favorite book? I don't think I can say the Poppy War trilogy, because if I say that and they read it with no prior warning or trigger warning or any content warnings, then they might full well send me their therapy bills, which I completely understand. But I do love this trilogy. This trilogy was really special for me to read. It was so hard to put down, and I feel like this trilogy wraps up in a way that is heartbreaking, yet completely makes sense. And it was a very satisfying ending, although it was extremely unfortunate and sad. I don't think it could have ended any other way. As I mentioned in my full-length video, I think that this series forces the reader to reckon with the brutal truths of history and look at those historical truths right in the eye. I also really like how R.F. Kuang uses fantasy as a medium to convey messages about colonialism, imperialism, and racism, among other darker themes. But I really appreciate how she doesn't shy away from discussing any of these topics. She doesn't sugarcoat it, she doesn't pretend that it's lighter than it is, and she uses very creative mediums to convey these messages. At surface level, I think you can look at this trilogy as a story about war, colonialism, and extractive economic interests, but for me, these books also made me think about war as it is depicted in media. Logically, I think we know that war is horrible and terrible and does horrible things to people and society. But I think we're so inundated with images of war, especially in the news, on social media, that we become desensitized in a lot of ways. Individual deaths become numbers, and we no longer understand war and colonial violence on a micro scale. I hesitate to draw comparisons between a fantasy book and the real world because I don't want to flatten real world tragedy to something like a fantasy fiction story. But I really think that reading books like this open your eyes to understanding how war really affects people on an individual scale as well as a massive scale. So at the surface, it's a great read, it's a great fantasy book, it's a great fantasy series, but on a deeper level, I think it does cause you to reflect on a lot of the images of war that we see in real life and how horrific it truly is and how we can no longer be desensitized to it. We have to understand the impacts of it. So I will forever love this series. I will probably reread it in a couple of years, but for now, I am recovering from this series for sure. I've seen the Poppy War trilogy be flattened into tropes, which I understand is a way for people to elevate or pitch books in order to get more people to read it. So I'm not knocking it there, but I do feel that in doing so, we lose a lot of what makes this story special. I think there's a lot of deep meaning imbued in this fantasy story, and R.F. Kuang's academic background really imbue a lot of actual history or historical inspiration into the story. So it's a very special read, and it will always hold a special place in my heart. I also realized recently that I've been saying character names wrong. I saw a clip of R.F. Kuang saying Naja or something like that, and Katai instead of Kate. So please excuse me as I have pronounced character names wrong in my full-length video, but love the book. The next book I finished was Babel by R.F. Kuang, and I also really loved this book by her. I have a full-length video discussing this read at length, and I also draw comparisons between the magic system in this book and Native Hawaiian history in language banning. So if you're interested at all in that discussion, you can check out the full-length video. And I think I'm comfortable saying that this book is my favorite. Babel follows Robin Swift, an orphan from Canton that gets the opportunity to go to Oxford in order to study and work as a translator at the prestigious translation institute, Babel. Again, Kuang leverages her academic background to imbue this dark academia/fantasy story with nods to themes of colonialism, imperialism, and cultural extractivism. One of my favorite parts of this story was the magic system. I think it was so creative, and to give you some context, the magic system is silver working, in which the wielder of the silver can inscribe pieces of silver with different languages and harness the power that is lost in translation when going from one language to another. I thought it was a really creative way to use as a vehicle for discussion of imperialism and cultural extractivism, and it really hit close to home for me given Native Hawaiian history and my identity as an Indigenous person and the history of extractivism that we in Hawaii face. So I really enjoyed this. I thought that this was a really special piece of literature, and I'm looking forward to recommending this to other people. Also, I think a lot of us here grew up in the age of dystopian novels, so if you love toppling an empire, then you would love Babel. I've seen some criticism of the book saying that the format was a little confusing, and I will admit that the first third of the book was a little hard for me to get through, and I actually put this down for a little bit and picked it back up. But I feel like the medium in which this is written was the perfect way to tell the story because you really become immersed in this world. It's so easy for you to imagine yourself there in the way that this is written. But if you're not used to this style of writing with a lot of footnotes, a lot of information and explanatory passages, then you may not vibe with this very well. But I, for one, actually very much so enjoyed it, and I thought that the footnotes served as little whispers from the author to us as the reader. So I enjoyed it, but I can understand why people maybe wouldn't like this and would put it down. But this is for sure my favorite book as of right now, so excited to recommend this one to people. Following Babel, I took a little break from fantasy and picked up Pure Color by Sheila Heti. Sheila Heti has been on my TBR for such a long time, so I'm glad I finally got to read this. And this book explores grief, mortality, and the inevitability of death through the lens of religion and art. I wouldn't call this a religious book by any means, but I've seen other people describe it as biblical, and I agree with that description completely. I think the way that it's written is very biblical. It mixes fantasy with fairy tale, with, all of these biblical type of passages that explore human life from start to finish. I really enjoyed how this book talked about life, love, loss, and what it means to create with impermanence in mind. And I wanted to read some passages, some of my favorite passages or quotes from this book, because I feel like these passages will stick with me for a very long time. And they were just so impactful in the way that I look at loneliness and grief. So the first passage is, "She felt so alone in those days, not that she minded. It is only when you get older that everyone makes you feel bad about being alone, or implies that spending time with other people is somehow better because it proves you to be likable. But being unlikable wasn't the reason she was alone. She was alone so she could hear herself thinking. She was alone so she could hear herself living. What do humans go to art for but to locate within themselves that inward turning eye which breathes significance into all of existence? For what is art but the act of infusing matter with the breath of God?" She had thought that when someone died, it would be like they went into a different room. She had not known that life itself transformed into a different room and trapped you in it without them. So beautiful, so good. These really do feel like Bible verses to me. I think the way that Sheila Heti observes life is so real and yet imbues this magic into what life is. Takes the ordinary and makes it something extraordinary and biblical. I keep using that word, but it's hard not to when reading Sheila Heti. So highly recommend this, especially if you're going through a period of loss in your life. I think this really described grief in a way that I hadn't seen before. And grief is such a hard thing to describe because we all kind of experience it in different ways, but also in the same way, if that makes sense. So, human experience described in such a poetic manner. I really am glad that I got through this one. If you follow me on Instagram, you already know what it is. I read Bunny by Mona Awad, and this was such a fun read. I loved this book. I loved the way it was written. I loved the ambiance and the vibe of this book. I enjoyed it way more than I thought I was going to, and I went into this book completely blind, which I think helped my reading experience. But this book follows Samantha Heather Mackey, who is an outsider in her small but competitive MFA program at a New England university, particularly among a clique of unbearably twee rich girls in her class who call each other Bunny and seem to move and speak as one. The best way for me to describe this book to you is a fever dream coated in vanilla icing. And this book reminded me a lot of Jennifer's Body because it is girly, it is cultish, it is horror, and it is so much fun. I thought the way that this was written was brilliant and fresh, and I'm excited to read more from Mona Awad. This was my first book from her, and I really, really enjoyed it. I didn't think I was going to enjoy it as much as I did, but it was just such a fun read. And I really hope that this book gets adapted into a movie because it would be so cool to see this story come to life on the big screen. My favorite part of this book was, as the reader, we never really know which way is up or down, and we rely wholly on our narrator, who can sometimes be unreliable. And I will leave it at that. I think it's best to go into this a little bit blind, but I hope you enjoy it. I've seen some people say that they didn't like the way it was written and that it read like fan fiction, which I completely disagree with. I don't think it read like fan fiction at all. I think it was cliche in a way that furthered the story. I think it was cheesy and a little bit kitschy on purpose. and in ways that didn't turn me away from the writing itself. So Mona Awad is my girl so far. I have Rouge on my TBR and I'm excited to dive into that one. But Bunny, I think if I know as a person is into horror, I might recommend this because it's just such a fun read. That's all I can say. It's so fun. The final book that I'm reading this summer is The Dangers of Smoking in Bed by Mariana Enriquez. And Mariana Enriquez has been critically lauded for her unconventional and socio-political stories of the macabre. Populated by unruly teenagers, crooked witches, homeless ghosts, and hungry women, they walk the uneasy line between urban realism and horror. These stories in her new collection are as terrifying as they are socially conscious and press into being the unspoken. Fetish, illness, the female body, the darkness of human history with a bracing urgency. So this is my current read and it has definitely gotten under my skin so far in a good way. I haven't read a collection of short stories in a while and I always find it so impressive how an author can create such an immersive experience for their reader in such a small amount of pages. And reading this has certainly inspired me to try my hand at short story writing. I don't think I'm comfortable sharing any of my short stories yet, but I really want to work on that skill. I picked this book up because I thought it would be the perfect transition between summer and fall and create that spooky ambiance that I'm looking for this fall. In my last video, you guys recommended a lot of great fall reads that were kind of in line with Mona Awad, but I wanted to take a break and dive into some short stories, but I will be getting to your book recommendations, don't you worry. But if you like short stories, if you like horror, if you are interested in hearing stories that have social, political commentary, but still are very visceral and scary, then I think this collection of short stories would work really well for you. Okay, friends, that's all I have for you today. I am really happy with the books that I picked up during the summer. It is really hard for me to believe that summer is over, but I'm excited for the weather to cool down, whatever that means in Hawaii. Usually what that means is it just rains more, but that should be fun. I feel like rain in the fall is the closest I'll get to turning of leaves and cooler weather, so I'll take what I can get. But I am excited to get into fall. I have a list of movies and books that I'm curating to share with you guys as well, so stay tuned for more book recommendations and book reviews. I'm so happy to have you here, and if there's anything specific that you'd like to see from me, I'd love to hear it in the comment section below. Please tell me how you'd like to connect with me. I am really wanting to create content that resonates with you, so if you have any ideas, if you have any requests, let me know and I will consider it in the comment section. Thank you so much for your time and attention. As I always say, time and attention are the most valuable things we have, so I'm appreciative of you giving me even the slightest bit of yours. Happy reading, happy summer, and happy fall. I'm so excited for fall. So I will see you guys next time. Bye bye.